Welcome back, DP Nation, to another episode. We are delighted to have you in the studio with us. So why don't you get a cup of coffee, a notebook, something to write with, and a Bible, and come along for the journey with us in this episode. Welcome back, DP Nation. We are absolutely thrilled to be back in the studio with you in this episode. And I know that some of you are probably saying, where have y'all been? And let's give a disclaimer before we go any further. The last couple weeks got absolutely hectic. And as much as we tried, there was just no way to make it back to the studio. So we give you our deepest apologies, and we will do our best to keep these rolling out moving forward. But we had people out of state, we had people out of country, we had people sick, and so we realized that unfortunately we just were not able to make it into the studio. But we are back. We are in the studio, and Brother Pound and myself are here in the studio tonight, and this episode is going to be straight to the point. It's going to be a little bit shorter, but it is going to be straight to the point. And we are going to talk about prayer and fasting. Prayer and fasting. And so to kick this off, I'm actually going to read two scriptures here and to just set the tone of this. The first scripture is about prayer, and it's Matthew 6:7. And Jesus is teaching the Sermon on the Mount. He says this, "But when ye pray, use not vain repetition as the heathen do, for they think that they shall be heard for their much speaking." And then I'm going to jump down to verse 16, Matthew 6:16, and Jesus says this, "Moreover, when ye fast, be not as the hypocrites of a sad countenance, for they disfigure their faces, that they may appear unto men to fast. Verily I say unto you, they have their reward." So these two scriptures make it very clear that when ye pray and when ye fast, these are not negotiables of any Christian's life, of any disciple, of any believer. It doesn't say if you pray. It doesn't say that you should pray. It doesn't say that fasting might be a good idea. It says when ye pray and when you fast. Prayer and fasting, and I know there's another scripture and I should have written it down, but Jesus has just come off the Mount of Transfiguration, which I believe is Matthew 17, is the Mount of Transfiguration.
We have it. It's the one we quote every Sunday night.
Yes.
Yes. So Matthew 17, and it's verse 21, and it talks about Jesus talking to the disciples, and he says, "Howbeit," let's give some context. Verse 20, "And Jesus said unto them, Because of your unbelief, for verily I say unto you, if ye have faith as the grain of a mustard seed, ye shall say unto this mountain, Be removed," say unto this mountain, "Remove hence to yonder place, and it shall remove, and nothing shall be impossible unto you." And then verse 21, "Howbeit, this kind goeth not out but by prayer and fasting."
So Jesus in this verse here is actually talking to disciples who were just unable to cast a devil out.
Yeah.
They were unable to cast the devils out of a possessed young man. And the father implores Jesus for his help and says, "I talked to your disciples and they weren't able to do this." And if you read it, the whole story, Jesus becomes a little bit frustrated. He says, "How long shall I deal with you? How long am I going to suffer this faithless and perverse generation?" He casts the devil out, and then the disciples say, "Hey, what happened? Why weren't we able to cast the devil out?" And that's where he says, "This kind goeth not out but by prayer and by fasting. And so a lot of this was actually, this podcast right now was actually born out of a question from one of our dear saints
The one and
and
only,
friends.
the modern Apostle Paul.
Yes.
So,
Reverend Paul Hicks. We have
Yeah.
a group text between several of the men here and then in Greeley, and Brother Hicks hopped on. He asked a question about prayer and fasting, and so it started a firestorm of texts. And I told Brother Pound, I said I didn't say anything in that because it's so hard to talk about that through text. But tonight I will say just the first thing that came to my mind. And the first person that I really discussed this with in depth, I believe, was my father. And then I know I've also discussed this a little bit with Brother Judah Williams, who was a dear friend of mine in Fort Myers, Florida. And then I was very honored to also discuss this with Brother Mutu. Some of you may know Brother Mutu, some of you may not. But he is a powerful man of God that travels through several different countries. I believe he's primarily around Singapore and Malaysia, but he moves throughout several different countries, and he has seen a lot, an immense amount of miracles in his life. And he was here a while back, maybe a little over a year ago now, and I was privileged to talk to him about this as well. And so when it comes to prayer and fasting, like I said, they are non-negotiable. You have to do them.
Yeah.
And really, my feelings on prayer, while it's not always easy, I believe the concept of prayer is simplistic.
Yes.
Prayer is talking to God and God talking to us. So we understand that it's communication with God.
Yeah. Yes. Absolutely.
When it comes to fasting, the one idea or concept of fasting that I feel like everyone grasps at first, and it's not always easy, but it is a simplistic concept, and that is fasting is the submission of one's flesh and submitting it to the Spirit. And so along with that, I know many people, and especially here in Christian Growth Center, many of us try to fast, and our goal is to fast at least one day a week. So we have a prayer and fasting chain here at Christian Growth Center that has gone on for, I believe now that it has gone on for 34 years.
That's amazing.
That there has been someone fasting every day of the week, at least 2 or 3 people fasting every day of the week in Christian Growth Center for 34 years now. And it is that submitting one's flesh to the Spirit. And then there are times where God will move on a Christian's heart, a very specific fast. And you have a choice, but you don't really have a choice because God's calling you. And so you submit to that. And that's a separate thing where God calls you away. And there is with that type of fasting, or with extended fasts, I feel like there is a concept and a spiritual principle in that type of fasting that, if we're not careful, many of us miss. And that is, and you see this clearest in Matthew. You can also read it in Luke, Matthew chapter 4 and Luke chapter 4. And I'll read it out of Matthew. It says, "Then was Jesus led up of the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted of the devil.
Yes.
And when he had fasted 40 days and 40 nights, he was afterward and hungered. And when the tempter came to him, he said, If thou be the Son of God," etc. You can read this all the way through. I believe it's verse 11 or verse 12, where Satan is tempting Jesus Christ, and Jesus is combating that temptation. You can read the same in Luke chapter 4, and I believe it's about the same verse 1 through, I think it's about the same verse 11 or 12. It could be a little bit shorter.
Yeah.
And what you see in this account in Scripture is that Jesus goes on an extended fast. He fasts 40 days and 40 nights. That's a lot of time.
Yeah, I haven't
I've
done one yet.
I know several people that have done that, but I have not done that. But what you see in this is that Jesus steps into, and this is the concept, Jesus steps through the spiritual door of fasting. So I personally believe that fasting is a door in the spirit that you step through. It is a portal.
Yes.
And the further that you go, you do submit your flesh, but really what you begin to do is you begin to confront the things that would confront the spirit. And so the first thing that would confront the spirit is your flesh. So that's why if you go on, say you go on a 7-day fast, probably till day 2 or 3, and fasts are always different. Sometimes I've done fasts where I never really even got hungry. And then I've done fasts where it seems like I got 3 minutes into the fast and I feel like I was going to pass out from hunger. So, but usually if you go on an extended fast, day 1, you'll be okay. You get hungry, but you're okay. And day 2 is a little bit, you're pushing. And somewhere between day 2 and through day 3, you'll really begin to fight your flesh in. Your flesh will think of every reason in the world why you should break your fast and eat. And what you've done is you've just begun to combat the first thing that will come against the spirit at your flesh. And the further you push into that world, you will begin to confront and do spiritual warfare with different things that are confronting what God wants to do. You see in this account, Jesus, and I know that he is God, but we must remember he is a man. He does this as a man to show us that humanity can do this. Jesus as a man pushes so far into the spirit world that Satan himself must come to confront him. Which tells me that through this fast, Jesus has conquered every other thing that would come against the spirit. He's fought he's fought his flesh. He's fought all the other spirits. Now, they may not have one at a time confronted him through this 40 days, but basically he has taken spiritual dominion over everything else to the point where the tempter, that's what it says, when the tempter came, he's pushed so far into Satan's kingdom that Satan has no choice but to come himself and confront him. This is like David and Goliath.
Yes.
The Philistines are sending forth their choice warrior, like the guy. They're sending forth the guy. Yeah. Satan comes forth, and Jesus conquers him. Yes. And this is why I personally believe, now I understand he's God in flesh, but I believe that Jesus received, as a man, he received all the power to cast out devils in this fast. For the rest of his ministry, when he encountered those spirits, he commanded them where they should go because he had already conquered them in this fast. He had taken the spiritual authority from them in this fast. Now, I understand he's God. When he speaks as God, everything submits to that. But I also believe that there's a spiritual concept that Jesus is trying to let us see in this story. And that is that you can fast so deeply that you can confront the spirits that are trying to destroy your city or your family or you. This is why you can see people go on extended fasts and they'll go long spans of time, and all of a sudden they'll have a relative that's been away for a long time all of a sudden prays through. Because that person in the spirit, they didn't do it physically, they didn't do it locationally, but spiritually they went to what was holding that person bound and they conquered it. And suddenly there's freedom. And this is why it's so important for us to pray and fast. When you pray, you are in communication with God. And when you fast, you are going out to fight. Now, I understand that there's a lot of fighting that goes on in prayer as well. And so sometimes in prayer, just as much as you are communicating with God, you are also confronting principalities and powers.
Yes.
And this is why the prayer and fasting are so powerful together.
It is. I think that's an understated thing, or something it's become cliche unless somebody's listening to this that has learned to, and I'm not saying that we've arrived. Prayer is one of those things that you just keep going deeper and deeper and deeper. But if you've prayed and seen God move, or you've learned to work in intercessory, you've fasted for any period of time, a called fast, and seen God break things. I said this earlier. We were talking before the podcast, but it's something I know I've heard years ago. But listening to a message from Brother Urshan recently on one of their midweek services, he made this statement. He said, "It's not a sin problem we have in the church; it's a lack of prayer." And I was talking to some people today, and I said, "How many times, we fight and we battle and we struggle, but when was the last time we got so desperate that we prayed it through, that it was no longer a thing, or we prayed and then we fasted until it broke?" And these were things I grew up on. These are things that are talked about. But how many of us, and this is a challenge, how many of us have really taken that to heart and said, "Okay, God, I'm going to pray like I've never prayed before, and I've got to trim the things and let the things go in my life that," because all of us have voices that are speaking to us. In the day and age we live in, there's so many voices. And I challenge some people tonight that I love dearly, and it's not something that I'm just telling them to do. Take a week, turn off all the voices, and say, "Okay, God, this week, maybe it's somewhere you want to go that you're saying, God, I've prayed and I've gotten so far, but I want to know you more." Or maybe it's lost loved ones, or there's a lot of needs out there. Well, what would happen? Yeah, maybe it's our churches, maybe it's revival, maybe there is strongholds that need to break, and maybe God's calling you. Maybe you're hearing this tonight, and it's not coincidence, or you're hearing it whenever you hear this, I guess. It's not coincidence, but God's calling you to say, I have a calling for you to break something, but I need a vessel that's willing to get up a little earlier, go to bed a little bit later, push the plate away one more day, and pray until this breaks, until this happens. What would happen if that just took place? What, you get 2 or 3 people in a church that say, "Okay, we're gonna grab the horns of the altar, and we're not gonna move until this breaks."
Yeah. And I know, excuse me, I know that there are probably more than just a couple people. Hopefully not many, but I know there's more than a couple people listening to this that are saying, "Okay, I feel challenged to pray. I feel challenged to fast." And so, and especially with a prayer life, where do you start? And I heard Bishop Booker, and I'll tell this in closing. It is a very powerful story. I heard Bishop Booker somewhere along through life. I heard him tell this story. I believe he preached it at Passing the Torch one year. And it's in regards to learning how to pray. And the story he told is that there was a man of God that had a dear friend that had ended up in the hospital, and they knew that this man was drawing close to the end of his life. And so he went to see him, and the man wasn't really where he should be spiritually, and they both knew it. And so they talked for about an hour. The man of God went into his friend's room in the hospital, and he sat down in the chair, and he pulled it, close to the bed, and he sat there. They just talked about life, talked about getting ready for eternity, and they just talked for about an hour, a little over an hour. And then the man of God stood up, and he looked at his friend, and he said, "You got to pray." And the man said, "Well, I don't really know how to pray. And how do you pray? And the man of God said, okay, this is what you do. He said, every single day, you need a time in your life where you pray. And he said, the way you learn to pray is you get this chair, you get it close to the bed like I have it right now. And he said, you just, in your mind, you imagine that Jesus is sitting in this chair. You imagine that just like I was in this chair, you put him in your mind, you put him in this chair, and you talk to this chair just like you talk to me. So we talked for about an hour today, and you talk to this chair because God is going to start coming and meeting you in this chair. And so he left, and the man said, I'm going to do it. I'm going to start doing that. And he left, and time went by, and then the man of God received a phone call. And it was the hospital, and they said, you need to come quick. There's not much time left. And he said, okay, and he got in his vehicle, and he headed for the hospital. And when he got there, they let him know that, hey, unfortunately, it's too late. Your friend has already passed on. And the man of God said, well, I'd kind of like to go up to the room if that's okay. And he said, yeah, that's okay. And so he went up to that room, and they had just, taken care of the body of the man that had passed away, and they were, taking him out of the room and cleaning the room. And the doctor, one of the doctors that was working that room and that part of the hospital for that time of the day, he came in and he told the man of God, he said, it's the strangest thing. The man of God said, what? He said, when we came in, when we found him, we knew that he was deceased. And he said, for whatever reason, he had gotten out of the bed, and he was draped over a chair. And he had gotten out of that bed, and he had draped himself over that chair where he knew that God was meeting him every single day. And he had come to a point where he knew that God was coming down to meet him. And one of those days when God came by to meet him, God said, you know what, why don't you just come with me? Yeah. And he took him in that moment. In that intimate moment of them just talking back and forth. You see this in Moses' life. When Moses dies, God says, Moses, get thee into the mountain, and there you're going to die. And when you read the closing verses of Moses' life, the only person that is present in that moment is God. Yeah. And it's because Moses had walked so closely with God that when it came time for Moses to go, God said, no, this will be between me and the dearest of my friends. Yeah. And so Moses' funeral and Moses' ending is attended by God himself and only God, because of the deep relationship between Moses and God. So in this episode, we want to challenge you. Do you have that relationship with God? And if not, then when you hear this, you need to go get you a chair and put it somewhere in your life. And every day you sit down across from that chair and you talk to God until you've built that depth of relationship. We're living in the last days, DP Nation. We're living in the last moments of the last days, in the closing seconds of eternity. And God's winding this thing up to take his people home. And we have got to thrust our hands into the harvest. Yes. We have got to get ourselves deeply engaged into what God is doing. So if you're not already doing it, once a week, fast. And don't be afraid when you feel God call you away. Don't be afraid to fast 3 days or 5 days or 7 days. You can do it. You can do it. Find somebody or find a couple people and hold yourself accountable. Go tell them, hey, I'm going on a fast. and let them hold you accountable. Let them ask you, hey, how's your fast going? Go talk to your youth pastor or your pastor's wife, or maybe if you're younger, go talk to a Sunday school teacher, talk to your parents, and let them hold you accountable to that fast. And a lot of times, the spiritual ones will fast with you. They won't leave you alone. They'll fast with you, or they'll fast portions with you to combat that thing together. And find yourself a chair that you and God can sit in and talk to God. So I know it's been a shorter one, DP Nation, but we love you all out there. We thank you for your time and your support, your love. This really, I know we say it's the DP Nation, but really it's grown into a wonderful family, and we cherish all of the feedback we get from you. We love you all. So take this episode, take it for what it's worth, and don't just listen to it. Like James said, don't just be a hearer of the word. But I like how this generation says it. They say, don't talk about it, be about it. So don't just talk about it, be about it. We love you, and we'll catch you on the next one.